Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. And this time around, based on the requests in the comments, we are going to be doing the Forces of the Tomb Kings. And this is a faction that I think is going to be interesting to cover because they're honestly one of the better balanced factions in the game. Obviously when the start of their life cycle, this was not the case. They were arguably one of the more broken factions. And Arkhan, as well as some of the overpowered constructs, were definitely a key factor there. But over time, they've kind of mellowed out a bit and been brought. Some of the most busted units have been brought down to size. Some of the less appealing ones have also gotten a few tweaks and buffs here and there, which has also sort of helped stabilize the roster. And because of that, I do think it's going to be interesting to see just where everything falls. I also want you guys to keep in mind that as we're going through this roster, I think a lot of units that may fall lower than one would think. It's going to be because, honestly, Tomb Kings just have so much variety. There's a lot of units that are viable and a lot of ways you can play them, really. There's very few units on the roster that I would consider very bad, and at the same time, very few units I would consider mandatory or near mandatory to field. And there's just a lot of strong option or decent options and a lot of ways to approach. So regardless, hopping right in with the head honcho himself, we do have Settra the Imperishable, or if you get focused by fireball spam or something along those lines, might be pretty perishable. But this guy gets an A tier, and some of you might think you should get S tier, and alongside Arkhan, I think there is an argument to be made that this guy's very strong. But the reason I'm not going to give him a higher tier than this, and the reason Arkhan's not going to get a higher tier either, is because honestly, Tomb King lords are all very competitive. Now, some of them are a bit more niche than others, but I think that all of them can be made to work with specific builds and compositions. I do, however, think Settra is one of the better ones, being a combination of combat lord as well as caster is obviously very good strength. He's got great items. He's got the Blade of Tra, which allows him to blind an enemy, debuff their stats. He's got amazing mount options. You put him on a horse, he's a great anti-large specialist. You put him on a War Sphinx, he's an all-around curb stomper. He can beat down infantry, he can run amok and avoid getting pinned down. He can sort of fight enemy lords and heroes and monsters. Maybe not ideally, but passably enough. You put him on a chariot, and he is death to all infantry. Like, I don't think there's any chariot in the game that compares to Settra on the Chariot of the Gods. That's his signature mount, and it shows. He's insane. Now, his lore, he does it Lord Necrotech, not always the best lore, but it does give you the ability to just spam constant heals for a wide army of skeletons. Also has some nifty debuffs like Usev's Incantation of Desiccation, but honestly, just the cheap spells, Narrow's Incantation of Protection, Job's Incantation of Cursed Blades, very powerful, and it can proc the passive and continuously heal your army, and that's very strong. You can have a strong core of, say, Settra and like 2 Tomb Princes or something as your elites, and then have the rest of your army be skeletons, and have a pretty competitive army. That said, Settra has one big disadvantage, and that is cost. He's incredibly expensive. Even on a horse, he can run into the mid-2000s, and if you kit him out well, you can easily have a lord over 3,000, taking up a quarter or more of your army cost. And this can be difficult to balance out. This can be difficult to make work sometimes. So he does get an A tier here, in part because of that cost issue, in other part because of the competition. There's just so much competition in the Tomb King's roster. And next up, kind of the opposite, the bad Tomb King, if there is really one, the leader of the Followers of Nagash, dabbling in necromantic sorcery and vampirism and God knows what else. We do have Arkhan the Black, and he's also an A tier. Now, at the drop of the Tomb Kings, he would have probably made an S tier because he was just busted OP. Tomb Blade of Arkhan especially allowed him to just heal constructs for ages, and basically allowed him to create a death ball of, like, say you'd have against like vampire counts, for example. This match was almost unbeatable, unwinnable because of Arkhan, because you'd have Arkhan, a few Necrotechs, and you'd stack them alongside Hierophant, as well as the Sphinx of Usev, and yeah, your opponent was screwed. They couldn't really do much. This was very bad for the vampire counts especially, but very troubling for many factions, really. Because if you didn't have strong AP missile pressure, yeah, you were kind of screwed. But regardless, modern day Arkhan, much better balanced. He's an okay fighter, not great. If you put him on a horse, he can occasionally fight weaker lords or defend himself a little bit, but you don't want him really being in the midst of combat. If you put him on a chariot, he's decent at running down enemy troops. He does have Strider, but it's definitely nowhere near the performance of the Chariot of the Gods. Still, definitely a decent combatant, and he does have Lord of Death, so you can get Spirit Leech, Fate of Buna, Soulblight, a whole selection of good spells, Purple Sun of Zerus, Doom and Darkness. All can be very, very potent in their own right. And he also does have a Skeleton Summon, the only Lord-bound summon in the Vampire. Or I guess you obviously have your free Ushapti summon, but the only summon you've got available as the Tomb Kings otherwise. And those are pretty nifty. You can disrupt enemy backlines, sort of block enemy troops off from coming in. Can be useful. He also, so that's his new revised Tomb Blade. He also does have the Liber Mortis, which is still a strong physical resist buff, and it just makes Arkhan an strong all-arounder. Now, next up, we do have High Queen Khalida, and she's going to get a B tier, and some of you may be surprised, but honestly, Khalida's not bad. She's not utilized as much as Settra or Arkhan, and she definitely lacks the versatility they have, but she is a strong combatant, has very, very, very high melee stats, well in the 60s for both melee attack and defense. She still has My Will. All of these lords do have some version of My Will Be Done, which is a very potent AoE buff. Of course, she's still got the curse. You can put her on a Necro Serpent to get some AP and get more out of those combat stats. And she's not a bad buffer for archers. Finally, her Venom Staff is honestly not bad against enemy blobs. Can really mess up enemy infantry. Definitely not a terrible tool. You won't always want to bring it. But still, decent. Her main problems are twofold. One, she needs a caster because she's the only legendary lord in the Tomb Kings roster that is not a caster herself. So you have to bring a caster with her. This can be expensive because Tomb King casters, the Lich Priests, are pretty damn pricey. And second of all, she's got some bit of counter synergy. She's a very strong duelist and fighting lord, but at the same time, her AoE buffs for archers essentially encourage passive play, and that's just... Obviously, you can use her defensively to sort of support a unit of Ushapti Great Bows and units like that, and that is really what she usually ends up doing. So don't get me wrong, it's not like there's no usage for this, but it is something of a counter synergy. I think it does restrict her a little bit in her realm of viability, really. Finally, she's got a lower end HP pool, and unlike Arkhan or Khatep, she can't run away like a pansy if your opponent starts focusing you, while being useful. Like both Arkhan and Khatep can spam spells. Even Settra can do this, really. And both Settra as well as the Tomb King have some really beefy mount options. Khalida doesn't have beefy mount options, and she can't cast spells, so this limits her utility outside of combat. So I would probably rate her at like a B-. She's probably the closest to a C tier out of these guys, but still a very, very solid and very respectable lord. Next up, we do have Grandpa Khatep, DJ Khatep, whatever you may call him. Interesting lord. I would put him at a stable B. His kit, the most important part here is the Lich Staff. Minus 15, or increases enemy cooldowns by 15 seconds every single time you cast. And this is with the Lord of Nekara, where you can spam dirt cheap spells all the time to be healing your Skelly trash. It's pretty insane. Essentially, Khatep can deny greenskins, for example, nigh indefinitely. It's pretty nuts. With constant spell spam, with his Arcane Conduit and all that, your opponent will probably not get WA until the game is effectively over, if you're casting spells diligently. He also does have bound Vortex spells, which is nice. He just got bound Sandstorms. Definitely great for beating up on squishy troops. This guy against greenskins is insanely powerful, but decent in multiple other matchups as well, for sure. That cooldown penalty is insane. Like, even against Hiles, for example, you need to deny a Star of Avalon or something, and if you're spamming spells, it'll do the trick. Besides that, as a combat lord, he's completely useless. He's like worse than Techless. He can't fight his way out of a wet paper bag, essentially, but you can put him on a chariot, in which case he can at least bully infantry a little bit. And if you put him on the Casket of Souls, he becomes an interesting sort of static defensive lord. You can park him in the middle of a box and try to snipe from there. Now, personally, I'm not very fond of this. I actually like Khatep, but I don't like him on the Casket of Souls because the immobility and the vulnerability to fire is definitely a weakness. And it's difficult to escape if you need to. And obviously, Tomb Kings being an undead faction are a bit reliant on that leadership to staying alive. So, not the biggest fan of the Casket of Souls, though it is a cool and interesting mechanic for a lord to see this. Finally, we do have our only non-legendary lord, and that is the Tomb King. This guy also makes B tier. Once again, he's not a caster like Khalida, so he does need to bring caster alongside him. That said, he once again has some decent AoE buffs. He's got a good selection of mounts. Most importantly, he can get a War Sphinx, so he can run amok and be decent against all targets, provide terror, that sort of thing. You of course do get Tomb Strike on him as well as Khalida, which potentially buffs your stats a bunch. And besides that, he's got this cool item called the Amulet of Fasta. And actually, both of his items are decent. One, I forget what it's called, but it grants you ward save, 22%, I believe, after you drop below 50% HP. But it's really the Amulet of Fasta that makes this guy tick, and in my opinion. And this is an item that reduces enemy shield block by 24% and armor by 30%. And it synergizes insanely, and I mean insanely well, with, and this isn't an AoE, by the way, it's not a single target thing. And this synergizes insanely well with other Tomb King debuffs. Stacked on top of the Legion of Demonetization, and stacked on top of Soul Blight or a Blade of Khatep from a Tomb Prince, you can drop enemy armor by up to 120 on a single target, or less on different targets. But for example, you can stagger out have two critical units whose armor you want to drop, focus those units out first, and then after that you've kind of already won the game a lot of the time. And it synergizes insanely well with archers. It allows you to get massive value out of a relatively lackluster archer unit, and it's something I think a lot of people miss out on, but is insanely powerful. Your opponent can bring Chosen, for example, they can bring a Blackguard or something, and all of a sudden those units are getting deleted from the game because they're getting focused by all this fire and their armor is meaningless. And for example, Dark Shards, the shields from the Dark Elves, you can annihilate them because you remove their shield value essentially, or remove most of it, and suddenly you're overwhelming them with Archer Fire. And it's a very nifty synergy, and in my opinion, puts him at a stable B tier. Which does get us onto the heroes, and there's only 3 to choose from here. First and foremost, I think we'll touch on the Lich Priest, and he's going to get a B tier. Solid caster. He's got some very good, in my opinion, he's got very good items, which is his big saving grace. His combat stats are abysmal. He's a very squishy hero, very easy to kill. He's not the most mobile. Even on a horse, he can be run down for sure. It's not like an elven horse with 90 plus speed. That said, he has some great items. He's got the Nefarious Scrolls of Mighty Incantations, which allows him to get more Winds of Magic based, and this is something you can cast multiple lines, but based on however many units are near him, you get more Winds of Magic gen, which is pretty awesome. Otherwise, he does have an item, the Canopic Jars, I believe they are, which grants 66% magic resist in AoE. And this is definitely pretty potent. It synergizes very nicely with Hex Wraiths, so unfortunately Hex Wraiths have dropped in viability a lot since Arkhan's nerf. And yeah, so but despite that, I do think, and the other problem with this guy is that he is, well, I guess his passive or his unique ability when he drops below 50% HP is not really worthwhile. It's minus 60 armor, but usually you don't want this guy getting sniped, and the reliability of this is very low, in my opinion. So it's definitely a lackluster curse compared to the Curse of Joff, or just a generic curse on your lords. And you've only got 3 lores to choose from: Death, Light, and Nekara. Very strong lores, but it's only 3 lores, so that kind of sucks. And besides that, he's just pricey, and that's really a big killer for this guy. So he's a pretty expensive caster, especially if you want to bring him with decent kit, and it's a bit of a limiting factor there. Next up, we do have the Tomb Prince, and this guy's actually going to make the cut as an S tier. It's going to be our first S tier, and one of our few S tiers, I think, for the Tomb Kings. And some of you may be surprised by this, but honestly, I think the Tomb Prince is one of the best. Yeah, he's one of the best tier options in the game, maybe even. As far as like within a faction goes, because you get AP anti-large on a horse, which is awesome. You got a mobile. It's like the High Elf Noble. It's a very strong hero. You can put him on a chariot. He doesn't have AP on his chariot, which sucks, but he's still a potent force on the chariot. Perhaps more importantly, he has some decent buffs and debuffs. You do get the Tomb Strike. You do get Guardian. He's got much more utility than a High Elf Noble, because you do get Tomb Strike. You do get the Curse of Joff, so when you drop below 50% HP, you drop enemy melee attack and cause them to rampage in an area around you. You do have the Blade of Khatep, which allows you to debuff a specific target by a significant portion. So he's all in all, he's got some very, very powerful items and utility there, stacked on the fact that he's a very good large hunter, and there's very few matchups where you don't want to bring this guy. Maybe dwarves, for example, he's a little lackluster, but honestly, he's just a very potent pick. Finally, we do have the Necrotech, and this guy's a little bit iffy. I'd hover between C and D tier for this guy. Unfortunately, I'm not a big fan right now. He used to be very powerful when the constructs were honestly a bit overtuned, but the biggest problem with this guy is that he kills infantry, but you've got a lot of stuff that kills infantry effectively, or more specifically, kills squishy infantry. His buffs to constructs require him to be very close to them, which is a bit lacking. The thing is, if you want to keep keeping up with fast constructs, you've got to put him on a chariot, which is very pricey. If you want to be fighting alongside foot constructs, then it's a bit more acceptable, but the fact is the foot constructs are not as effective for the Tomb Kings, which restricts the Necrotech's viability there. He's only got 2 heals, so bring him as a heal simply as a heal battery is very expensive. He's only got 2 heals to cast in the first place, which is very limiting. Not the greatest fighter. Specializes in killing infantry, which you've got plenty of units. Squishy infantry, which you've got plenty of units to do. You got cheap chariots, you got tomb guard, you got higher titans, you got your light cav, your Necron horsemen, especially your archers. The list goes on. You've got a very strong potential to deal with those units. The Necrotech's not something unique there. His potion of strength. It's not a potion of strength. It's like elixir of might, maybe it is. It grants more weapon strength and attack to a target. The problem is that most of the targets you want to buff rely on AP weapon strength, not normal weapon strength with buffs. So essentially, you're just going to melee attack, and this is definitely a lackluster benefit. If it buffed all damage output, it would be much better. But because it doesn't, it's very lacking. And finally, the Embrace of the Sun, cool item, debuffs enemy melee attack by 9 and fire resist by 22%. The problem is the fire resist doesn't synergize that well. There's not too many units in the roster that do fire damage. You got Hex Race, you got the Sphinx of Usef, and you got higher Titans. And I guess Settra. But that's really it. And it's a very limited and niche lineup of units that benefit from that spell or that ability. And fortunately, I just think it puts this Necrotech at C tier. He still has some potency because he has those heals, and he's not a terrible combatant, especially if you throw him on a chariot, he can be decent. But I definitely would rate him at C, probably leaning towards D tier, in fact. Which does allow us to move on to the infantry corps. And first and foremost, we've got normal Skelly boys, so the Skelly trash. These guys are actually going to get a C tier as well. The reason for this is simple. If you're going to bring Chaff as the Tomb Kings, it's usually to enhance the width of your army and zone out cavalry and enemy heavy hitters, and skeleton spears are honestly better for that. They get S tier because they got charge defense against large, and they still have the same silver shields, and they only cost 25 more than skeleton swordsmen. And the combat stats on both units are abysmal, so you're not relying on them to win the fight. You're just relying on the unit to hold, and the skeleton spears are better at holding. Now, this doesn't mean that skeleton swordsmen are useless. They're still a viable unit, and I want to make that clear. That against some factions, these guys can do work. They can beat up on lower-end troops, chaff troops. They can definitely be a pain in the rear to deal with. Against dwarves, for example, where the anti-large really doesn't matter, these guys can be a good target, a unit to sort of mess up slayers and be a pain in the rear that way. But I think they don't deserve more than C tier. Whereas skeletons, spears, you're almost always going to bring them. Besides the dwarf matchup, I don't think there's like a single match where you're not going to bring skeleton spears, really. The easy S tier, in my opinion. And it's not like a crazy good unit or anything, but just within the Tomb Kings roster, they work so well at defending backlines, enhancing your width, that sort of thing. Next up, we do have the Necron Warriors, and these guys are probably going to land a D tier in my book. And the reason is simply these guys they just have very bad stats. Their melee stats are pretty terrible. They, in fact, I think lose more often than not to Empire Swordsmen, who cost 125 gold less than these guys. Now, obviously, this is without their Realm of Souls. With their Realm of Souls, they become a bit more efficient, but Realm of Souls is a very finicky and unreliable mechanic. Sometimes your opponent can just focus a unit or two of skeletons out, and suddenly you've got no benefit out of it. And your Necron Warriors are now trash. Their melee defense is abysmal. Their melee attack is not really great for a dual-wielding unit. They're not fast. They're designed to hew through cheap trash, but they don't do so all that effectively. Like I mentioned, they will lose to swordsmen in a straight-up fight without their Realm of Souls proccing. And the fact is that for 225 gold more, you get Tomb Guard, who are brutally effective and are probably a leaning towards S tier. I'm very much leaning to giving these guys S tier, but I'm going to give them an A for now. The reason being, these guys have silver shields. They've got 50 armor, which is respectable. Not great, but decent. It falls in the same category as, say, Saurus, essentially. You've got 50 or 60 there. Very high weapon strength, decent melee stats. Unlike, say, Graveguard, who's very specialized against infantry, these guys are all-rounders. They can do damage to squishy large as well. Decent amounts of AP, despite being a non-AP unit. Come in a 90 model unit, which is very strong. They'll mow through most cheap trash, and there's really not much else to say. These guys are just a very solid unit, and they honestly are a big part of the reason for our Necron warriors, who are not that much cheaper, just so much worse. Because Necron warriors don't have shields, they don't have good melee defense, they bleed like mad. They're not any faster than Tomb Guard. Yeah, Tomb Guard's just very, very, very good. Bordering on S tier. Tomb Guard Halberds are going to land a B tier. I think they're a very respectable and decent unit, but I think they are a bit niche. The simple fact is their melee stats, or offensive melee stats, are not that good. And you don't always really care for the AP anti-large on a foot unit. The simple reality is, as Tomb Kings, you're oftentimes just trying to get more width with, say, Skeleton Spears, and then relying on constructs where you're shooting for the main strike force in your army. At which point, paying extra for a very expensive halberd unit, which costs over double of what your Skeleton Spears cost, is a problem. It does get pricey, and these guys almost cost as much as, like, say, Sepulchral Stalkers, which are cheap-ish backline defense that actually has good mass, for example, as well as AP and anti-large and all that. And that's not to say these guys are not good. A halberd with AP and silver shield and all-around good stats, really not bad. Like, don't get me wrong, these guys are very, very solid. But I don't think they have the ubiquitous usage of the Tomb Guard. They can't really deal with enemy infantry that well. They definitely lack in that department a bit. And yeah, that's why they're going to land a B tier. Still, don't get me wrong, they are a very potent unit. And yeah, they're good. Which does give us on to... Well, actually, that's it for the generic infantry. Next up, we do actually have the specialists, the faction unique ones, the Crypt Ghouls. These guys are going to land a C tier, and the reason for that really is the fact. Well, so first of all, they are telegraphed pretty heavily when you pick Fallish Nagash rather than generic Tomb Kings. That's definitely a bit of a disadvantage. Besides that, they are of course very squishy, very flimsy, and you don't have Lord Vampires to compensate for mistakes because, well, you're Tomb Kings, not vampire counts. So you can't just Invocation of Nag these guys back from the dead. That said, I think as a anti-squishy supplementary unit and shock unit, they are, in my opinion, significantly better than Necron Warriors. And the reason for that is, while squishier by quite a lot, they do have poison, which gives them some utility and some supporting viability. They also do have a higher weapon strength, which, you know, they've got better offensive stats. They're better at crumping enemies quickly, and they're a lot faster. You got 38 speed, which allows you to do some aggressive plays and opens up some unique possibilities with an otherwise relatively slow faction. If you want to go aggressive with, say, lots of constructs, these guys synergize relatively well. They've got 38 speed as opposed to 28 all the skeletons. And in my opinion, that frees up some opportunities. The fact that they're so heavily telegraphed and very difficult to keep alive for the roster does hold them back, but still more viable in my opinion than Necron Warriors. And that gets us to Regiments of Renown. And King Nikesh's Scorpion Legion, probably also going to land an S tier. A very powerful, very competitive Regiment of Renown. You've got poison. You've got just better stats. You've got higher armor values. Yeah, they're just a very solid Skeleton Spear version of a unit that's already very, very powerful. They are cheaper than Tomb Guard with Halberds. Obviously, you don't have the AP and the raw staying power, but the fact they poison allows them to snare enemy monsters a little bit better, and helps you slow down enemies when they're rampaging around your backline. Can help if they're fighting. For example, you've got monsters that snare an enemy in place, and then you push in the King Nikesh Scorpion Legion, and now you've got support, and you're preventing your opponent from fleeing, and it's very, very strong, in my opinion. They can definitely deliver some good support, and I think they'll land an easy S tier. Basically, they're just better Skeleton Spears, and the Skeleton Spears are already a very powerful unit in this roster. The simple fact is that your sort of defensive infantry isn't here to kill stuff, and that's why the Tomb Guard Halberds fall off a little bit, where the Spears are good. These guys are just cheap and hold. Whereas Tomb Guard, sure, they kill more, but they just cost more. But generally, your killing is wrapped up in bigger stuff. which does get us on to the Kepler Guard. These guys, they're not the greatest. I would rate them as a B tier. I don't think they're bad. I think there's a few niche matchups where they can be very powerful, where regen and their raw weapon strength, which is they actually have a pretty significant AP component. I think it's like 33% of their damage is AP. So it's not terrible at raw damage output. Obviously, though, they lack shields. They are side raid from normal Tomb Guard. Very squishy. They have regen, which means fire weakness. And they are fairly pricey. That said, as an anchor unit, especially if you're going against a cheaper faction, they can definitely mow through cheap trash for days. They can act as a very strong support tool. For example, like, honestly, even against greenskins, they're not terrible because you park them alongside like 2 Hierophant Titans or something, and then just spam Khatep's Lich staff to deny your opponent Wa, and these guys will mow through everything except Black Orcs. And so as long as you avoid fighting Black Orcs or have your normal troops deal with the Black Orcs, or your AP troops deal with the Black Orcs, these guys can hold it very well. And I do apologize for the table, it's just so squeaky. I need to tighten some screws. Besides that, well, that's it for infantry, actually. Moving on to archers, well, there's not much to be said here. There's only 2. Makes life simple. Normal archers are going to land probably... I would give them a C tier. I think, so if it's synergized with the Amulet of Fasta or armor debuffs, they immediately probably spike to like an A or B. But by themselves, the unit is not that great. It's got a few synergies, but it's kind of off-meta synergies. So I think they're probably hovering between an A and a B. The unit is a bit overpriced in my opinion for the performance it provides. Not a terrible unit by any means, but also not the greatest. Maybe. It's a toughie. We will give him a B tier. I'll be nice. I'll give him a B. And the Legion of Demonetization, the Legion of Facht, is also going to get a B tier. And the reason for this is that, honestly, if you're going to bring... You're only going to really bring these guys with skeleton archers. Now, granted, these guys have more range than generic skeleton archers. They do have a bit more armor. They're a bit tankier. But the fact of the matter is, you bring these guys, much like the Rustiers, to support your firing line. And if you bring your Shopti or Bone Giants or AP monsters, the fact that these guys do armor summoning is almost irrelevant. It's probably doing you more harm than good because it means your opponent's not AP, whatever friendly fire they do. If you've got AP monsters, for example, your opponent's damage is going to get more value against your monsters. So they really are mainly there to support the archers, and these guys are all kind of... It's kind of a symbiosis here between these guys, generic archers, and like Tomb Kings and Lich Priest with Lord of Death, or Arkhan with Lord of Death, that sort of thing. But outside of that synergy, this unit is just not that great, and definitely, basically, where Skeleton Archers and the Blessed Legion go hand in hand, you will basically bring these units together in every match, in my opinion, or almost every match. Which does get us on to Cavalry, and first and foremost, I suppose, Nakaran horse or normal skeleton horsemen. These guys are honestly not very good in my opinion. I'm actually going to rate them as a D tier. They are cheap, and that's really their only, and unbreakable or pseudo unbreakable because they're undead. But that's really their only saving grace. They've got very low speed for light cav. It's very hard to get them into good position. They've got abysmal melee stats, bad armor. Don't hit very hard. Fairly easy to crumble and destroy. Like, honestly, Reichsguard on the charge, perhaps you guys saw it in my recent turning battle against Black Iron, but I managed to catch a lot of his light cav with the Reichsguard pretty handily, and yeah, these guys are just too slow, really, and when Reichsguard can get you on the charge, you know your light cav is not much of a light cav, and it's a killer for this unit, made even worse by the fact that the next unit here, which is actually going to land itself in A tier, Necrotech Horsemen, are so much better. More armor, more mobility. In fact, they actually have 2 more speeds than Necrotech Horsemen. Decent all-around stats. They're essentially the Tomb Guard of Horsemen. Decent all-around mid-tier cav. They don't have much armor compared to, say, Empire Knights or Black Knights or units like that, but still passable amount of armor at 50. They've got shields. They've got very solid melee stats, high weapon strength. So good sustained combat stats. Just an all-around good unit. And If you need a high mass block unit, these guys are great. If you need some backline harass, that's like a little more dedicated and meaty and will do some more damage. These guys are not a bad choice. They really give you the staying power you need. And that does bring us on to, if I could find them, the Necropolis Knights. So Necropolis Knights as spears, probably also going to land a D tier. The reason being that using these guys offensively is, in my opinion, using Tomb King Cav, sort of going Cav heavy with Tomb Kings is, in my opinion, not necessarily the greatest idea. They're not a faction that is optimized for heavy duty Cav play. The fact that they don't have great healing, they do have the Necrotech heals, but those are expensive and limited. The fact that they don't have great healing is very restrictive there. The fact that they don't necessarily have the best buffing and supporting lords for those pit fights, in comparison to Carl Friends for Empire, or Bordalo, or Fae for Alariel, for other factions that can go Cav heavy, is a bit restrictive. These guys are also, their low model count tends to leave units surrounded and get beaten down from all angles. Definitely lower armor as well for an elite Cav at only 90, so makes them susceptible to even non-AP units. And no anti-large bonus, which means that their performance against other Cav is definitely not the greatest. That said, they can perform okay in certain niche situations. I don't want to say they're useless. Like, just like the Necron Horsemen, so as a throwaway disruption, the Skeleton Horsemen can be good, or the Necron Warriors can be decent against chaff if you get your almost souls procking. Similarly, the Necropolis Knights, they can do well in specific instances, but it very much relies on your opponent not having the sort of Cav power to stop you, and I think part of the problem is that these guys, because you need, so if you bring these guys, you need some sort of anti-large to deal with enemy Cav, and now you're either coughing up for very expensive Necros Fangs or Oshapti Great Bows, but these guys don't synergize that well as say Halberded Necropolis Knights with Oshapti Great Bows. Halberd Necropolis Knights will land a C tier. I think they still suffer a lot of the issues of normal Necropolis Knights. They are relatively flimsy, they are slow, on a faction that, once again, doesn't have the best tools for supporting Cav play. But they do have AP and anti-large, and that is a big win right there. Plus, of course, the poison that both these units get is a nice win. They don't have shields, which is a little bit of a limiting factor, but honestly, if you want a defensive heavy Cav, these guys are pretty solid. They're kind of like a budget Demigryph Knight, and stacked on top of Shopti Great Bows, forcing your opponent to advance, or Bone Giant forcing your opponent's hand. These guys can do a lot of work. They can do a lot of hurt, and provide some support, some Necrotech healing, or something along those lines. They can definitely do you proud, and that's why they're going to land a C tier here. And I want to be clear, guys, that honestly, everything from D tier up on the Tomb King roster is viable, and I don't. And I know there's going to be people saying, "Oh, this so is showing unit. I love using it. It does really well." And honestly, I believe it. A lot of these units can function well in the right circumstances or when utilized correctly. I just think that these guys are a bit less viable than the ones above. It's something I just want to clarify, I think. And that's it for Cav. Oh, actually, no, it's not. I lied. I'm a liar. I'm a fraud. Hex rates. So the unique unit for the Followers in the Gash. They're going to land a D tier. And before, I would have actually probably ranked them at C or B for the faction, because Arkhan could support them. Arkhan made these guys tick, because Arkhan brought you healing. The problem is that right now, if your opponent sees that you picked Followers in the Gash, he's going to know you're telegraphing ethereal units. A competent opponent is going to bring magic damage at that point, and Hex rates die to magic damage horribly. The only thing you can really do to counteract this effect, because you can't heal them in any way, shape, or form, is, well, Nero's Incantation of Protection, which, well, that doesn't help against magic damage, but if you just want to resist, like, pure physical, that can help a little bit. But is the Protective Canopic Jars on the Lich Priest. But this forces you to bring an extra caster, who costs a good bit, pretty penny. And that's a big limiting factor. And essentially restricts X-rays to sort of a niche surprise pick where you drop some nasty terror bombs and run amok in your opponent's backline if they didn't prepare properly, or maybe bring like one unit and surprise jump them from behind when they don't expect it. Because, like I said, Cap play isn't really the forte of the Tomb Kings, but this unit can kind of pull it off. And yeah, so I think the Hex race can be very niche, but in general, just because of how heavily telegraphed they are and the very specific circumstances they require to do well. And plus the low leadership, once they hit a certain threshold, because you can't heal them, they're going to crumble to death, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it very much restricts them. And these guys are honestly like the sole reason I wish Arkhan's Blade had simply been reworked to only affect undead units and simply ignore constructs, rather than making it a summon, because I honestly still don't like that. But these guys are a D tier because of it. Which does move us on to missile. Or actually, I guess I don't want to include Chariots in here. What do you guys think? We'll put Chariots in here as well. Skeleton Chariots makes an easy B tier. Honestly, they're dirt cheap. That's the biggest saving grace here. They're dirt cheap, have decent mass, pretty mobile, can plow through enemy lines. You don't care if you lose the unit. They heal from Realm of Souls. They don't do the greatest damage, of course, but I have been caught with my pants down by some of these strats with Chariot play, and because they're so cheap, you can bring a lot of them, and they swarm your opponent. Definitely a very powerful unit in its own right, if utilized correctly. But a little bit niche, I think, in comparison to the more versatile units we see up here. But still just a very, very strong unit. Which does get us on to Missile Cavalry and, well, first and foremost, I guess we got Skeleton Horsemen. These guys are going to land a C tier. Not a bad unit. These guys are a bit of a niche unit. I think they're very slow for a skirmisher cav, and that's a big restrictive factor. They're cheap for a skirmish cav, don't get me wrong, but 76 speed for a skirmish cav is abysmal. It means that heavy cav will often catch you. Like Grail Knights or Dragon Princes decide you're going to die, you're going to die. You can't escape them. That said, they can still do some good skirmish work. If you're able to zone with Necrotech Horsemen or big monsters or big beasties, or have these guys supported by Ushapti or pushing up alongside an infantry advance, they're a very good unit, and they can definitely sort of pay their dues, and I wouldn't underestimate them. The Skeleton Chariot lands a B tier for similar reasons to the normal Skeleton Chariot, the one with the Archer. Same combat stats as the normal one. Only thing is that you now have a shooting unit. Because there is 9 models, there's a decent amount of damage potential out of those archers. And the cool thing about archers is that if you get a rear charge with these guys, you're often applying that under missile attack debuff to your opponent's leadership. And you crash in with the chariots, and now you've got a rear charge, and you've got these compounding leadership penalties. And you can really break an opponent quickly. And it essentially gives the chariot an extra leadership debuff that's independent. You don't have to like control archer unit separately to focus a target that your chariots are targeting to get that extra leadership penalty. Your chariots on auto fire will just fire at will and do this leadership damage, and it's very nifty. And once again, they are a bit more expensive, which is a little more limiting, but I think they still deserve a B tier. Which does throw us on to the monstrosities, the monsters, and we're going to be dividing these up into, well, we want to divide them up into missile and we'll do monsters, and we'll do sort of heavy missiles. That's what we'll do. Carrion, these guys are still, despite the nerfs, probably an A tier. Very mobile, annoying to kill because of the high relatively high melee defense. It can often kill models because they've got relatively high weapon strength per entity. Very quick, very annoying to deal with. Just a good zoning tool in general. Definitely, I think, deserving of an A tier. It's a pretty simplistic unit to explain, but I think they're a good bit better than bats are for the purpose of just backline harass, and because of that, they should earn an easy A tier. What's next up? Next up, we do have the Vanilla Ushapti, and these guys are probably going to land in a C tier, and the reason being is that their stats are honestly not that good. They are relatively mobile for Monstrous Infantry. They've got a decent armor, which is relatively rare for Monstrous Infantry. They've got AP. They've got a bonus search infantry. The big problem is that bonus search infantry just kind of sucks. It's only 5, so their effective melee attack against infantry is like 28. I think off the top of my head, I think they've got a baseline of 23. That's not good. Like 28 is still abysmal. It means they almost never, they don't hit very consistently against better infantry at all. It's not like Croc scores where you can put them up, you stack them on top of skinks, and they beat the snot out of like Phoenix Guard or something. Ushapti will never do that for you because their melee attacks is just so bad. It's just a huge limiting factor there. The weapon strength also isn't the greatest at only 72. And once again, because that bonus for infantry is only +5, it only goes up to 77, I believe. So definitely not the greatest trait for them. They are, however, mobile. They are relatively cheap, and they do have AP, and you can stack on Tomb Guard and advance quickly. So they have their niches. I think they are more versatile than some of the units down here, but ultimately, definitely a bit of a restricted unit, and one I wouldn't use too often. Which does get us on to the Tomb Scorpion, which easy A tier. Vanguard's deployment was obviously a bit niche on this guy, but besides that, insane attack animations that often get him out of trouble and are honestly just obscene. Probably the most frustrating animations in the game to deal with. The unit is often just able to escape stupid surrounds because of those animations, and it's very frustrating to deal with, especially for a faction like Dwarves, for example. Very low to the ground, makes it hard to shoot with AP missiles. It's a relatively cheap unit, only 1,000, applies terror, has decent armor, bonus for infantry, just a very solid all-rounder. There's not much bad to be said about the Tomb Scorpion, besides the fact that it's been nerfed to the point that it's no longer great against single entities or cav or that sort of stuff, but it's still able to take on those units to an extent. And I think it deserves an A tier, because it's just still so powerful. And as a single entity, you can heal it with a Necrotech and get some value that way as well. And the Vanguard allows you some silly shenanigans occasionally. Sepulchral Stalkers. This one's a toughie. They border on... They might be D tier for the Tomb Kings. I think they'll end a D tier. So the reason being, these guys are not particularly bad stat-wise, but they are a bit... So the thing is, as an anti-large defense, usually you're either going to zone away with spears, or if you actually want to kill your opponent's large, you might bring defensive Necropolis Knights Halberds, or a Tomb Prince plus Settra or Arkhan or Khalida on defending the backline, or you're going to have like a Necro Sphinx to do the anti-large work. I feel like, or you're going to bring, and if you do bring a single, sometimes you might bring like a single unit of Sepulchral Stalkers, and the Regiment of Renown, the Eyes of the Desert, are the one you will see in that case. And the problem is these guys are just not very versatile. They're pure anti-large essentially, and they're not even that great of an anti-large unit at that. Being relatively slow, having relatively low weapon strength, being a bit difficult to use their charge defense occasionally, and the fact is that their missile attack is kind of meh. Doesn't generally generate much value. Very simple missile play, low HP. It's not a terrible unit, but honestly, as far as the Tomb Kings are concerned, you just got better options for backline defense, and these guys don't cut the mustard, and you can't really use them offensively as well as the way you can use, say, Necropolis Knights with Halberds, because they're just not as mobile. They're not as mobile as Necro Sphinx, or that sort of thing. So that does rank them at a D. Which does get us on to the big boys, the monstrosities for which the roster is renowned. And first of these is going to be the War Sphinx. This guy is going to land a B tier, and I'm sure some people are always screaming and disagreeing. The reason is that oftentimes you're not going to bring more than one War Sphinx, and if it's a one War Sphinx, it's probably a Settra or a Tomb King, right? That War Sphinx. It's kind of like this ancient Stegodon, a very powerful unit in and of itself, but generally you're going to bring the mount option before you bring the generic option. So I do think it deserves a B tier. Still a very powerful all-around monster, but definitely a bit limited there. Just because of the competition with your Lord options and the high costs on those. I do believe the next in cost is the Hierophant, and this guy's landing a C tier. Now, very good utility for a unit monster. You've got a huge HP pool, you've got AP, you've got fire and magic damage, which is often very powerful. You've got over 9,000 HP with good armor. So unlike a giant, which dies to goblin archers, this guy will not suffer that sort of nonsense. Bad mobility is definitely restrictive here, but you also get a lot of utility abilities. You've got Shem's Grim Gaze, you've got a Bound Spirit Leech, and you do have a ability that generates Winds of Magic on this guy. So he's got some great utility. The big problem is that he's slow and clumsy. So while he's able to slow crawl and is insanely potent against, say, greenskins, where you can use him as an anchor and just deny your opponent wall with Khatep, I think that in general, the Higher Titan is, and then you just heal him with, say, Necrotech. I do think that in general, the Higher Titan's slow speed and lack of agility makes you very susceptible to missile play, and makes you very vulnerable to most enemy units. There are these few matchups where it shines very much, but and a general usage, because there's so many AP missiles, almost every faction has access to some AP missiles, it does sort of fall off and struggle a bit. And I think that's just a restrictive factor. Finally, the Necrosphinx, and honestly, this guy used to be the premier anti-large monster for the Tomb Kings, but I feel like since its nerfs, it's actually fallen off a bit. Now, obviously, the Sphinx of Usep was even more of the premier anti-large monster, but I feel like the Necrosphinx has fallen off a bit. And I think the nerfs hurt it bad. It's much less effective at killing large now, and it's a very expensive investment still. And the result is that it's just fallen off a good bit. It's still a potent anti-large force when utilized correctly. It has very high mobility, decent armor, AP, anti-large, all that. But you don't get the missile resist of, say, Shaggoth, which is definitely a bit hindering, and especially against factions that can bring decent AP damage. And like I said, the stats are just not quite that good. It definitely struggles. I do believe that before, for example, Sphinx of Usef could beat down Kolek or come close to doing so in 1v1. Now it gets handily beaten down by Kolek or Shaggoth. I think even a Shaggoth might beat like a Necrosphinx now. It's come a long way in dropping in performance, and yeah, the unit's just not as good as it was. But still a decent choice, and still definitely has its niche. But I think in general, if you're looking to bring down large nowadays, it's going to be via mass archers or princes or Settra or Shop the Great Bows or units like that. Which does bring us to the unique stuff. Bats, honestly a D tier. The fact is, carrying are just better than bats in most cases. The biggest difference is they actually kill models more consistently, really. Besides that, their stats are pretty similar, but the fact that they can kill a little better and are a little bit sturdier is generally enough to win them the day there over bats. But it's definitely not a very... but the bats are the... and that's kind of just it. And the fact is that when you've got two units that are almost identical, and one of them is just a tiny bit better, or a bit better, and that unit is just way better. And bats, well, why bother when you've got carrion? Like, unless you're really cash strapped and can't afford that couple extra gold for carrion. Dire Wolves, this is a bit of a toughie. I think I'll give them a C, and the reason being is that you don't have much high-speed mobility. Like I mentioned, your light cav only has 76 speed, which is terrible. So the fact that Dire Wolves have 95 speed is a big win. It allows you some proper backline harass as the Tomb Kings. That said, it is very easily telegraphed because, once again, you're playing as Fullerton and Gash. And they are a bit pricier, I believe, than the Vampire Count variant. And they crumble very easily, and you can't heal them because you're not Vampire Counts. And that's a big restriction. But I do think that niche of being very mobile, cheap, light cav, essentially, is something that the Tomb Kings lack, and it can help you in certain cases. And then we do have the Regiment of Renown, Sepulchre Stalkers, the Eyes of the Desert, and I actually think these guys rate a B tier. I enjoy using them quite a bit, and I've seen them used to good effect as well. As a defensive unit, the fact they have Stalk makes them well protected against enemy shooting. The fact is, they do have decent combat stats, and the extra chevrons mean they're actually passable even against infantry, though certainly it's not where you want them in life. Infantry is the bane of these guys, but if push comes to shove, they can do some stuff there. And yeah, you got AP, you got anti-large. What more could you ask for? As a backline defense unit, they're pretty cheap and cheerful and efficient. And I don't think there's much else to be said for them. The simple fact is that as Tomb Kings, you have a lot of backline defense options, though. And because of that, I think they don't warrant more than a B tier. But yeah, still a respectable choice. And one you will see relatively often. Which does bring us to Sphinx of Usef. And this one's also going to get B tier. Back in the day, it would probably be an easy S. But significant nerfs as was its insane cost of 2350, I believe it currently is. It's rough. It's rough stuff. This is a very expensive unit. It's very difficult to field, and while it is better than a normal Necrosphinx in basically every manner, you can get some fire resist in there, and you get fire and magic damage. The fact is, it's just so expensive and so difficult to field, especially with the relatively costly Tomb King Lords, that it just falls off a bit. And like I said, it's no longer a premier anti-large duelist the way it was before. Before I'm pretty sure, like I said, that it could outfight Kolak, or came damn close. Maybe it was like a basically 50-50 fight or something, I think, before the nerfs. But now it gets handily beaten down. It costs more, I believe, than Kolak, which is, you know, it's rough. It's tough to justify that, and it's still a potent force against large. And if you're able to play it safe and keep the unit alive long enough, it will deliver. It can munch through large most of the time very effectively. You throw in some buffs like Nervous Incantation or Joust Incantation, and you've got some crazy power. But just be aware, it's no longer the premier anti-large unit that it once was, and it's not sort of a staple unit in every Tomb King roster the way it used to be. And I think that's really the key thing. That like A and S tier are generally pretty staple or reliable, consistent units, super consistent units, and then B and under. From B, you're starting to look at units that are a little bit more niche, and I think the Sphinx of Usev is definitely there. Next up, we do have our missiles, and this is the last category. And well, Screaming Skull Catapult is landing F tier. I'm sure no one's surprised. I have an absolute hatred of this unit. I think it's garbage. I know somebody's going to be screaming, but the take cover debuff, you can nuke enemy leadership. And you know what? If I'm going to nuke enemy leadership, I'm not going to bother with a 700 gold piece of crap artillery piece that does nothing for me. Honestly, I'll just accept the loss of that debuff and bring more. And bring Doom and Darkness and debuffs like that, and I'll settle for that. That'll be fine. I'll manage. The simple fact is that the Screaming Skull Catapult just does almost no damage on hit. Really, its only benefit is that leadership debuff, but paying I do believe it's 650 or 700 gold for a unit that only does leadership debuff is abysmal. That's just basically unacceptable, and I can't think of a single build where I'd legitimately run this unit. In a serious manner. Obviously it has that meme potential for leadership bombing, but I think you can get good enough leadership bombs as Tomb Kings without having to resort to potato tier artillery bees. Next up, I suppose it's Ushapti Great Bows. And these guys are an easy A. Amazing counter to heavy cav, good counter to single entities. Decent at defending themselves. Once you've expended your ammo, they can beat down enemy infantry and light units reasonably well. They've got some AP of their own. Not great, but okay melee stats. Pretty nippy, so they can kite infantry. They're actually not terrible against elite infantry either, because they do so much damage per shot. They're usually one-shot models. They outrange most missile infantry, besides other weapon teams, essentially, like Giselles and deck gunners. But they outrange everything else comfortably. Because of that, I think they just deserve an A tier. They're a very, very stable and consistent performer, and tough to shut down. Yeah, I think Ushapti Great Bows great, honestly. And I don't think they're a staple of every build anymore the way they used to be, but they did get a few slight downward tweaks, but still a very potent force, and can definitely hard counter a lot of big monster plays and cav plays, and honestly makes some matchups difficult for some factions. Like Bretonnia kind of struggles because Ushapti Great Bows can butcher their cav so well. Next up, the Casket of Souls. This guy, I struggle a little bit on where to put him, and it's partially because I just don't use the unit very often. Admittedly, like I feel like if there's a unit I just don't use very often on the Tomb King roster, I might actually use this unit less than the Screaming Skull Catapult, because I try to meme it up with the Screaming Skull sometimes and just have fun. Whereas this unit is actually kind of legitimately decent. It's got a tighter spread in a somewhat recent patch, and it does pretty well against infantry. It can definitely wreck clumped up blobs. And it does grant more wins in Magic Region, which is very, very powerful and useful. The big problem is that it's very expensive. And so much like a Hell Cannon, if this gets sniped out, and that's relatively easy to do, it's definitely a bit of a risky pick. Because you're paying 1,200 for a unit that may or may not die quickly. And yeah, so I think it's solid C tier there. Can be good, but also a bit worrying to use on it. It can definitely be risky. Finally, we do have the Bone Giant, and this guy's also going to land B or C. Tough one. A very stable unit. I think I'll give it a B. Demolishes heavy cav, and that's really the big selling point here. It's okay as a counter battery unit, okay against monsters. Can fight in a pinch. Most significantly, it annihilates cavalry. And so I think it deserves a B tier. It single-handedly really messes up some matchups. Most significantly, I think Bretonnia suffers from this guy. Much like their Shopti, but even worse perhaps, because their clumped up cav can just get destroyed, and a single bone giant can just ravage cavalry formations. The biggest problem with this guy is the inconsistent. Maybe that puts him at a C. Because the shots are sometimes very inconsistent. I'm sure some of you guys have seen the replays where these guys just whiff and whiff and whiff, and sometimes it's just odd and frustrating. But I think it's a C to B. It's definitely an interim unit, but a very, very potent one nonetheless. I think I wouldn't take my indictment, my declaration of this guy as a C tier as a sort of indictment of this being a bad unit. Finally, we do have the hands of God, the chosen of gods, Regiment around Shopti. I think I'd actually get a B tier. They're actually below normal Shopti, and that's because I think they lack utility. Normal Shopti are good against basically everything. There's not really a target they're bad against. No, maybe not the greatest in an artillery duel. Maybe not the greatest choice against Cav compared to, say, Bone Giant, but they're very versatile and all-around unit. They'll do okay in every situation, essentially. There's almost never a situation where they are unusable or terrible. That's not the case for the Regiment of Renown. There was actually, in a recent tourney replay, actually, where I played against Zardar, and he brought this unit. And in the matchup, the way I built my army, there was legitimately nothing these guys were really good for. My infantry was too cheap to be worth shooting. Plus, they're spread out, and that limits the utility, really, of these guys. And I didn't bring Cav, so their scattershot had no Cav to shoot. And against single entity or very low model count entities like Hippogriffs and Lewin, they're useless. So they are they're more niche than normal Shopti Great Bows. Now, they're still very powerful. They do a lot of damage with that scattershot, but yeah, I think they aren't worthy of more than a B. Regardless, that is the Tomb King roster for you guys, broken down into my personal tier list. As always, all comments, critiques, questions, and all that are welcome. I do like reading your guys' replies and seeing what your guys' take is on things. I do think the Tomb Kings are definitely one of those factions that are in a pretty good balance spot right now. I don't think too many of their units are crazy good. I also don't think, and really even these units that are up here in S tier, it's less of a crazy good thing and more they just sort of suit the overall playstyle most of the time. Like, you can't really say Skeleton Spears are OP or Tomb Prince because the Tomb Prince is relatively pricey. You can't even say he's that OP. It's just that they synergize so well with the roster. And yeah, so I really think like roster is in a good spot. Honestly, I'd say like every unit here from C tier up is very competitive and or relatively, at least relatively competitive, if not very competitive. And even the D tiers are viable to an extent. There's really I think the only thing the Screaming Skull is very bad. But yeah, I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you put your input and thoughts down below, and I will respond as soon as I can. I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.